How's it going, YouTube? Coach Weston here with Good Lift Performance. Today, I'm going to go over my favorite variations for the squat, bench, and deadlift for powerlifting and go over how I program them. And before we dive into the video, if you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel. It would mean a lot. Also, leave a like on the video. It helps grow the channel. And then in the comment section, I would love to see what are your favorite powerlifting variations. So first, let's talk about what is a variation, because I think it's important that we establish that before we move on to my favorite variations. So a variation in powerlifting is something that, or an exercise that looks like the squat, the bench, and the deadlift that we do in competition, but has something that is different about it. Whether that is a different range of motion, whether that's a different tempo of the lift, or that maybe we just change out the bar altogether. Maybe we're not using the competition bar, we're using a specialty bar. But it still looks like the squat, the bench, or the deadlift. It just has something different about it. And so the reason, there's pros and cons to why we'd want to use variations. The pros are that while it looks like the main movement, it is going to stress your body in a slightly different way. So this can help reduce the wear and tear on your body. Obviously with powerlifting, it's a lot of repeated effort of those three movements. And so having a subtle change in that movement can help not overly stress the same structures over and over again, like your joints and your tendons. So this can help reduce the wear and tear on your body. It can also just create some more excitement for training where it's even though it is a squat, it's a slightly different squat. And so that can be more exciting to try and go execute because it's something slightly different than what you're used to, as well as it can reinforce a technical position or a cue that we're working on. Specific variations are going to highlight a specific part of the lift. It's going to make it harder. And so if we're using, say, like a tempo, that can help us with our descent and controlling the descent in case a lifter is. There are also cons as well to using variations. And so one of the main cons is that while some variations are really useful, other variations that might look really useful can actually be not very useful. So anytime we're doing something that's not the competition lift, there's always a degree of less transfer of, okay, this will make me better at squat, but will it be more effective than just doing more competition squat? And so some specific variations that are very close to the lift will be still very effective and worth our time, but there's going to be other variations that might be further away, or some variations that are sneaky that look like they would be useful but actually end up not being useful. A really good example of this would be like a block pull deadlift, where we're deadlifting with the bar elevated. I was trying to combine two words there. We're trying to deadlift with the bar elevated, so it would theoretically work on your lockout. We could load this up a lot heavier. It's going to be a very short range of motion, but it would seem like it would work on your ability to lock out heavy loads. Well, in reality, what a lot of coaches have seen and what I have seen is that heavy block pulls aren't very effective because they change the position that you end up training in, and so you can get a much more efficient position, and when you're doing block pulls, and it's not the same position that you would be in doing a full deadlift when you're trying to lock out. So you end up training a different position, and then just the really short range of motion doesn't really get very effective reps in. So like something like a block pull doesn't end up being very effective, even though at first glance you would think, oh, this is going to be a great variation for lockout strength. So while there's lots of great variations, there's also lots of bad variations, and so we have to be careful about which ones we're choosing. And then to the other point as well is some athletes will actually get worse with adding in too much variation. I have seen where some athletes anytime you throw in a variation, even something that's like very specific, like a pause squat or a pause deadlift, which usually across the board is a great variation, that might throw off the athlete's rhythm with that lift. And so adding in too much variety can actually be detrimental to that lifter. So you have to make sure you're identifying, does this athlete actually need to use a variation? And then we have to identify which variations are actually going to be useful for the athlete, because not everyone needs to do variations. Some athletes are going to respond really well to just doing the competition movements plus some accessories, while other athletes will respond better to having a larger variety of variations in their training, whether that due to the working on specific technical things, or maybe they just need it to help accumulate more volume that doesn't beat them up as much as the main lift. So let's get into my favorite variations. Starting off with the squat. I'm going to go over my top 3 for each of these. So for squat, I would say my number 1 variation I like to use, and it's a tie between 2 variations, and I'll go over why it's a tie. It's either the pause squat, which I usually prescribe as a 2-second pause, or a tempo squat, which I usually prescribe as anywhere from like a 3 to 5 second tempo on the way down. Now, if you are in the culture of competitive powerlifting, you've probably seen the debate on Instagram about which one is better, because there's debate over that. And I think that they both have their uses. It depends on the athlete. And so why we would use this variation or these variations is to improve the athlete's descent into the hole. The descent is arguably the hardest part of the squat. And if you can get your descent down, controlled and efficient your descent is, the better your overall squat's going to be. So using a variation to help the athlete improve their descent is going to be very important. And so the debate between variations comes from, well, with a tempo, does the tempo squat carry over to the main squat? Does it disrupt the athlete's ability to control the weight in terms of, does it make them go slower than they necessarily need to, and then that makes them slower in their main lift? So it really depends on the athlete. And so with my interpretation of this, what I think is that depending on the athlete you have in front of you, you're going to use one of the two. And so athletes who, and this is sort of like opposite ends of the coin here, for athletes who they don't think at all while they lift, I love using a tempo squat. And so what I mean by that is you may know an athlete who, when they start the lift, they sort of just black out. They sort of just, it's like in pool when you try to hit the cue ball and you just kind of hope for the best. That's how they squat and lift in general. They kind of just like, all right, I'm going to descend in the hole. Good luck, have fun. And they don't really think about what they're doing. Not that we want the athlete to overthink, but they just don't have any sort of thought process at all. They're just like, good luck, have fun. For those athletes, I really like a tempo squat because it slows down the movement and forces them to stay engaged in the lift. They have to pay attention to what they're doing. And that's the biggest thing, that the reason their descent is so poor is because they don't think at all during the lift. So using a tempo helps them stay engaged during the entire portion of the lift. And for these athletes, I actually see them, they don't do very well with pauses because of the fact that they don't think. They're just going to descend into the hole really fast. They're going to probably sink way too deep, and they're going to sort of sink and slide into the hole, and they're going to have a really shitty pause. And so the pause just ends up making their bottom position worse. And so for those athletes, I think that a tempo is better because it actually forces them to engage mentally in the lift. Versus on the other end, athletes who I think do better with the pause squat are the overthinkers, who if you give them a tempo, they're going to overthink the entire way down, and it actually ends up, in my experience, they end up changing the way they squat altogether. It's sort of weird, like they'll overhinge a lot of times in the tempo. And so tempo ends up being very dysfunctional. I think this is where tempos get a lot of hate. It's because a lot of powerlifting athletes are very analytical. And so when they do a tempo, they end up over-exaggerating the tempo, and they over-exaggerate their normal movement pattern. They overthink it, and they way overdo, and they like change their entire movement pattern, which isn't what we want, right? We just want them to improve their descent. And so for them, a pause squat is actually more beneficial in my opinion, because for them, we are only creating a pause. So they're going to be more mindful of the pause. And what that's going to do is it's going to create a deceleration effect when we get into the hole. They're going to decelerate into the hole, have a solid pause, and then pop out, which is ultimately what we want. We want them to control down into the hole. And so since they're thinking about the pause, they are anticipating having to stop. And so they're going to decelerate into the hole, which is why that is effective for them. So they're opposite sides of the coin, where they both will improve your descent into the hole, which I think is the most important part of the squat in terms of coaching it. But they do it differently depending on the lifter psychology. So I think that the pause/tempo is my number one variation for that reason. For the pause and tempo squat, how I'm going to program these is it's going to be low to medium reps. You don't really need to do high repetitions on tempo or pause. That kind of defeats the purpose, because the higher the rep set, the more technical breakdown we're going to have, and we want these to be very clean, sharp technical reps. So we want to keep the repetitions on the lower end, and then you want the exertion to be anywhere from like low to moderate. You can technically push these up a little bit higher, but you want it to be high enough to be challenging, so you're actually challenging the position, but you don't want it to be so hard that's going to bleed over into your competition lift, right? So capping it around like a 7 to 8 RPE is probably good. If you're using it as like a tertiary recovery squat, like in the middle of your week, you might want to keep it at a 6 RPE, right? And that's more like you're using the tempo or the pause as a refresher of what the athlete needs to do in between squat sessions. And so there you might want to use that as a 6, keep it at a 6 RPE. Versus if the athlete is only, let's say, squatting twice a week, and you're using it as, yes, a reminder to help the main lift, but also you need more squat stress in your program, you can definitely push the RPE up there. Going on to number 2 is the high bar squat. I really like high bar squat, especially for most athletes are going to have a low bar squat position. And so for our low bar squatters, I love a high bar squat. If an athlete is more of a high bar squatter, I might use the safety squat bar in this position. But I generally like the high bar more than I like safety squat bar. The reason I really like high bar squats is because generally it feels easier to recover from, especially on the elbows and shoulders. So that variation allows athletes to get in more squat volume a little bit easier, as well as having a more upright position with more forward knee travel, which is generally how I coach them to do the high bar, is that I believe I've seen it develops more strength out of the hole. And maybe that's only psychologically that happens, but I really feel like if I can get an athlete to get their high bar stronger, if they're more of a typical low bar, they usually are stronger and more confident coming out of the hole. Their quads are stronger, they can extend their knee with more force coming out of the hole, which is obviously the hardest part of the squat besides the descent that we just talked about. And so I really like high bar squats for that reason. I think it builds strength out of the hole, and it also it gives you that psychological difference of training, right? And it can be easier on the shoulders and elbows, doesn't beat them up as much. It also seems like it's easier to do higher rep sets on high bar. If you give someone a set of 8 on low bar, they're going to complain a lot. But if you give them a set of 8 on high bar, they generally don't complain as much. It just seems easier to do. So that for that reason, it's easier to get in volume, and I feel like it builds a lot of good strength out of the hole. So that's why I really like high bar. And so with high bar squats and SSB, so the reason I'm not as big a fan of SSB, even though it basically fills all the same roles of it saves your shoulders and elbows and allows you to be more upright, more knee forward travel, is that a lot of athletes feel the SSB in their back more than their legs. So I tend to go with more high bar than I do SSB. But if the athlete likes SSB, I'm totally game for it. It's just I see that a lot of athletes don't respond as well to SSB. But regardless, so for this variation, I'm generally going to go higher repetition, because here I'm thinking about more hypertrophy or even more like strength ranges. So anywhere in that more like 4 to 10 repetition range. And then for exertion, I generally going to go for more of like a moderate to even higher exertion here, because we're generally going to use this as a secondary squat a lot of times. And so we're going to be trying to, and with higher reps too, the higher the reps set, normally the higher the RPE needs, or the proximity failure needs to be, in order to have more effective reps. And so with that being said, I'm generally going to have athletes push their high bar or their SSB a little bit harder. Now, obviously that could change depending on the athlete, but generally that's how I see it, where the tempo stuff and the pause stuff, that's going to be more lower exertion, low to moderate, lower repetition, more technical. This is going to be more like, you're thinking about it as like hypertrophy, or more of just a squat variation that we're going to push. We're going to be doing more moderate to higher reps and more moderate to higher exertion. My last variation that isn't technically a barbell lift, but I really like it, it is the belt squat, which, no surprise, right? This is a very common exercise to use, but I put it in here because even though it's not a barbell lift, it still will play a role as squat volume. And so for belt squat, I like using it for athletes who have a harder time recovering from just squat volume in general. And so how I would use this is I would use, lower volume primary squat or variation. I would do less sets, less reps, especially for athletes who can't handle a lot of high reps in their squat, where I like to use belt squats, because I can keep the rep range below, say, 5 reps on their main lifts, and then I can give them sets of 8 or 10 or 12 or even 15 on the belt squat and really get in some higher rep volume that is very similar to the squat but doesn't beat them up nearly as much. So belt squat's a great way to get in volume for athletes who have just not built well to squat, or for athletes who can't handle higher rep sets. And so that's why I really like the belt squat, because it kind of acts like, a lot of people think about it as like a hypertrophy or an accessory, but even though it doesn't hold the same weight as a competition lift in terms of volume, I still think about it as more squat volume. And when I'm thinking about programming, I really think I consider it a part of the athlete's total working sets or working volume for the squat. So for belt squat, programming wise, generally going to throw this on the back end of one of the squat days, if not both, depending on the athlete. And then we're going to keep this pretty high repetition, and we can push this pretty close to failure, like 8 to 9 RPE across the board, just because it's going to be easy to recover from, and it's going to give them that good leg volume that they need to kind of push up their primary squat. On to bench press. So with bench press, similar to squat, the challenging part of the lift is the descent. How do we bring the bar down to the chest, as well as the pause on the chest? I think that the pause, a lot of people mess up the pause, but a lot of it comes from their lack of control during the descent. So we're going to work on that descent. So similar to squat, I think that a tempo bench, where you might do like 3 seconds down, a 1 second pause on the chest, and then go up, I think that works really well for athletes. Tempo bench is more universally accepted as a great movement. There's not a lot of athletes who don't respond to a tempo bench. Versus with the tempo versus the pause squat, that was much more of a debate. Tempo bench is much more widely regarded as a great variation. So tempo bench is great because not only do you get that pause on the chest, but you have the descent you have to tempo it all the way down. And what's really important about the tempo bench is making sure that the athlete doesn't speed up the tempo or just drop it on their chest that last inch, because that's the most important part to control the range of motion. If you want to start fast and then slow it down to the chest, so be it. I think that's less effective than just having a consistent tempo. I coach it as a consistent tempo, but you want to really make sure that you control the bar all the way down to your chest, especially that last inch, and then you have a nice solid motionless pause and then fire it off your chest. If you can get that part of the range of motion down pat, you're going to have a really, really solid bench press. And so that's why I really like tempo, as well as it forces the athlete to engage leg drive for longer, so it can help really train leg drive as well. So it's really a phenomenal variation. It's one of my go-tos for helping athletes improve their bench press, because I think the foundation of a good bench press is the pause, which all starts from the descent. And so if we can clean up that descent and pause, we're going to have a really great bench press. For tempo bench, it's going to be similar to the tempo or the pause squat in terms of programming. We're going to keep the repetitions on the low to medium end, and then the exertion on probably more towards the medium end. Going too light isn't going to do much, but going too heavy could also disrupt the flow of it. So I find a moderate rep range on a tempo bench is the best. So probably more sets, less reps, and a moderate exertion, like 7 RPE, 7 to 8 is great there. The next variation I'm really big fan of is the Larson press. This is known to be also kind of known as feet up bench press. They're a little bit different. So more or less, this is a bench press variation where we're not using leg drive. Our legs aren't even on the ground. A Larson bench is going to be, you're going to have the same arch, but your legs are just going to be propped up into the air. They don't really need to be hovering up, but you just need to have your legs kind of out to the side, not creating leg drive. But we're still going to try to create the same arch and position that we would in the competition bench. Feet up bench is where you are literally going to bring your feet up onto the bench. Either they're going to be straight out, just kind of dangling in front of you, or you can bring your literal feet up to the bench and have more of a knees are bent and your feet are actually on the bench press. So that variation is going to create more of a flat back position, which they have their pros and cons of when you would want to use either, but I'm not going to go down in depth with that right now. I'm just going to go over mostly the Larson press because that's the main one that I use. So we're not using our leg drive, we're not using our feet, but we have the same arch in this variation. And so the reason I like Larson press is because bench press, especially for powerlifting, is very, very technical, and we get a lot out of the leg drive. And I think that using a variation that allows us to just develop raw upper body strength is really, really important. Yes, leg drive is great. We want to make sure the athletes know how to use that, but we also want to make sure the upper body is actually getting strong. Novice lifters and early intermediates fall into this trap of over specializing too early. They get really good at leg drive really early on, and then it takes away with how much you actually have to use of your upper body, and then their upper body doesn't get as developed because they're not using as much force due to the leg drive, and then they have that big arch, and so it's reduced range of motion. And so with the Larson press, you're almost always going to have an increased range of motion, and you get rid of the leg drive, so it's just all upper body. Especially when I program Larsons, I do a lot more of, a lot of athletes are going to be max width grip. I like to bring it into more of a moderate grip, say like pointer fingers on the ring pinky fingers on the ring instead of pointer fingers on the ring. So instead of out here, you bring them in here to increase that range of motion. So really, this is all just about building more muscle in the same movement pattern, using the muscles just in a different way, more range of motion. It's going to help build more muscle and more just general strength in that position that you can carry over really well to the competition bench. I have used this variation so many times with athletes, especially for athletes who have like a back tweak, who can't get into a full arch. I have literally built athletes' bench presses almost purely off of Larson pressing, and then once their back is healed, we brought it down to competition lift, and it's like we didn't even skip a beat. It's so similar, but it's less stress on the back, and it just builds your upper body strength so well that when you add the leg drive back in, you're just that much better at benching. So I'm a really big fan of Larson pressing, especially in the off season. So, or like away from competition. A lot of athletes will benefit from keeping it in. So it just kind of depends on the athlete, but I really like using this variation. I think it's great at building upper body strength for the bench press. For the Larson bench, you can really do almost anything with that. Generally, I'm going to go with the more moderate to higher repetitions, sort of like the high bar, right? I'm going to go more moderate to higher repetitions, and then also more moderate to higher exertion, because it's really easy to recover from. And so you can push those reps, you can push the exertion and get a lot of benefit from that. And it's also easier to recover from in general. And then for number 3 on my bench press variations is the long pause bench press. So as I said, having a strong pause is really important. And so a long pause can be very effective for helping teach the athlete to stay tight for a long period of time, especially if you're getting ready for nationals, you're expecting a longer press command. Teaching the athlete to be ready for anything is very important. And so they need to know, all right, I need to be able to stay tight and be able to maintain my pause and potentially wait for a longer press command in case of something happens. And so doing the long pause can be very, very effective for that. I find it less effective for actually improving their pause compared to the tempo bench. I think tempo bench actually improves your technical ability with the pause. I think long pause is better for preparing the athlete for longer press commands. Or a long pause can be a great, especially for high frequency benchers, it can be a great tertiary or quaternary day of, you can still be very, very similar to the bench press. It's going to carry over really well. But with the longer pause, you're going to reduce the amount of weight you have to use. And so it's going to be easier to recover from. It's going to make you feel sharper and more like explosive for your primary day. And so I think it works really well as sort of a recovery technical day in a high frequency bench program. I don't necessarily use it, as I mentioned, as a way to improve the pause. I think tempos are better at that. So that's why I like the long pause. For athletes who they like maybe on their third day who just need some extra recovery, some like a lighter technical work that still feels very specific to the lift, I think that a long pause is great for that position. For the long pause bench, programming wise, I'm going to be doing similar to tempo. I'm going to be doing lower reps, more sets, and then lower to moderate RPE. Generally, because in my programming style, I generally use this as more of a technical recovery day, and so I don't really need to push the exertion here. You can technically push the exertion and use it like that. That's totally up to you. I'm not saying it's bad at that. I just don't personally use it that way in my programming. I like the long pause as that more recovery technical day. So it's going to be less reps, potentially. It might even be less sets because it's only going to be on a lower priority day, but you could do more sets there too if you want to get in volume there, and just give them like maybe do like a 3x3 and make it like 6 to 7 RPE, just get them feeling good, moving good, stuff like that. And then last but not least, moving on to deadlifts. Deadlifts have the least amount of variations because it's just a concentric portion, right? We don't have that eccentric. And so there's a lot less things that we can manipulate about the deadlift. And so that pool is a lot smaller. And even within that, there's a lot less that are even very effective for improving the deadlift. So we have a very small pool of ones that work, but from those, there are a few that really stand out. And so the number one deadlift variation, which is probably the most popular deadlift variation, if you saw on my Instagram story when I took a poll, it showed that everyone's favorite variation was the pause deadlift, which it's for good reason. It's a very good variation. You pause on the way up. Normally you're going to be pausing about like only an inch or so off the ground. It's different than like the pause squat or the pause bench, because those you pause at the end of the range of motion, the end of the eccentric, but obviously on the deadlift we don't have the eccentric, so we're going to be pausing at the start of the concentric. It's almost like the exact opposite. And so one thing that's really important to know is when we are doing variations, we have to understand why we are trying to do them. And so there's almost like two different ways to do a pause deadlift, and I think they both have their utility. One way to do a pause deadlift is to have a longer pause and have it be a very like motionless pause. And so this is what you would more consider a normal pause deadlift. And so the big reason you'd want to use this is because it will reduce the amount of weight that you can use. It's going to be a self-limiting variation. And so this is going to help us get training volume in while also reducing the amount of weight we have to use, which can be very useful for the deadlift, since deadlift is usually the exercise we can lift the most on and is generally going to be the most fatiguing for people. So having a self-limiting variation can be very useful, as well as having that distinct pause can help people really be aware of their starting position and really focus on that. And then we also have this doesn't really have a distinct name, but in my mind I almost think about it differently. I call it a rolling pause deadlift. And for those of you who are into powerlifting, you've probably seen on Instagram people who do pause deadlifts, but really all they do is end up slowing down. Like they break it off the floor, they slow down a little bit, they feel like they're pausing, right? But the bar actually never stops moving. And they call it a pause, but they basically just fly right through it. It's definitely slower. They're definitely slowing down in that range of motion, but then they fly right out of it. And there's never actually a very distinct pause. And so this variation actually gets a lot of hate online because you're not actually pausing the lift. But we have to consider what is the effect that we're getting out of it. And so what you'll see with a lot of athletes who do the pause like this is that they can actually lift a lot very close to their max. Like the difference between their pause deadlift and their actual competition in terms of their training max is very, very similar. It's almost like no difference. And you'll see a common trend. Some athletes literally feel like they can deadlift more when they do the pause than when they don't pause. And so what's happening really in this scenario is that not that they're stronger pausing, but that when they do the rolling pause where they slow down in the beginning and then they blast through the pause, they are spending more time getting into a good position. They're being more patient off the floor and knowing that they're going to have to pause right away. And then once they get past that point, then they blast through it, which is honestly what you want to do in most deadlifts, especially like a sumo deadlift in particular, where it's slow off the floor and then it's fast to lock out. So doing that rolling pause can actually, even though it's not pausing, it can actually train the lifter to do what they need to do. And so that's where we have to be very particular about, all right, do I overcoach this variation and make them like actually pause this, even though they're doing a rolling pause and it's actually making them deadlift better? If the variation is still making the athlete better, if it's creating technical improvements, then it's accomplishing the goal, right? So we need to prioritize that. We need to prioritize, is the variation doing what we want it to do versus is the athlete executing the variation to the exact specific detail that we need it to, because that actually might make it worse. And that's actually something that I think a lot of coaches and do wrong, and something that I used to do wrong is, this is more just newer coaches, I would say. More experienced coaches, I think, see this and they kind of understand it, right? But for newer coaches, I think this is something that they do wrong, which is something I did wrong for a long time, which is overcoaching the variation, because then it can actually be detrimental because you're overemphasizing how long they're pausing or how long the tempo is, when that part of it doesn't necessarily matter as much as, are they getting the positive effect out of the variation that we want to. So there's, as I said, there's two kind of ways we can do it. We can do the strict pause or more of the rolling pause, and it's important to understand when and where you want to do that. For programming these, you're generally going to do low rep pause deadlifts. Now, there are some sumo pullers that do really well with high rep, and so they might do high rep pause. Really depends, but generally you're not going to do a high exertion on these, but there's also a case for everything. So it really depends on how you're programming these and how you want to use them. So if you're using these for more of a fatigue management, self-limiting variation, you're going to want to go with lower reps, lower exertion. But if you're using this as more of a secondary deadlift and you're more doing that kind of rolling deadlift, you could technically do these for higher reps or even push the exertion a little bit depending on how the athlete responds to that. So yeah, there's lots of different ways you can program it depending on the goal you're trying to get out of it. Next on my list, number 2 for deadlift variations would be something that a lot of people don't think about as a deadlift variation, but I think it's very important, is the RDL, the Romanian deadlift. So a Romanian deadlift is where we are going to start at the top. You're going to hip hinge back, bring the bar is going to come down your leg. Generally, it's going to end at around the bottom of your knee for most people, and then you come back up and really try to focus on that hip extension. And so I think that's a really great variation, because where a lot of powerlifting programs are very specific, where it's a lot of comp deadlifts and then pause deadlift, and we don't do a lot of exercises that specifically work on the hip hinge. That's the main focus of that. With especially a conventional deadlift, right? We still have that knee extension off the floor plus the hip extension at top, and by doing that whole range of motion, we don't get to really overly focus on the hip extension, because the weight generally needs to be something that you can also knee extend off the floor, right? So we don't really get to train the hip extension to its full capacity at that point. So doing something like an RDL or a stiff leg deadlift, even where we're really emphasizing the hip extension, we have almost no knee extension involved, I think is really, really important and helps with lockout strength in particular. When I have done meets, or when I've had athletes who have taken out the RDL, I've noticed a decrease in their lockout strength for a lot of them. And when we put it back in, that lockout strength usually comes back. And so it's one of those things where you don't notice the effect that it's having until you take it out, and then you realize what it was doing for you. So the RDL is, I think, an important variation for both conventional and sumo. Once again, it doesn't have the same weight in terms of the volume and how it's going to affect the body as your competition deadlift will, similar to a belt squat in in your competition squat, right? But I think it's still very important to add in there and to conceptualize how it's going to affect your total pulling volume, because I do think it can be very useful for that. As well as there are certain conventional pullers that actually just use an RDL on a separate day of the week as sort of a secondary pulling motion. So it can be very, very useful in that regard too. So I think the RDL is sort of an underrated variation that is very, very useful. For programming the RDL, this is another one where we're going to probably stick in the higher rep ranges, but we can also kind of push the intensity on this a little bit. I think a lot of people just kind of throw it in on the back end and be like, oh yeah, just do 3 sets of 8 at 7 to 8 RPE. Where we can push those a little bit more, and you actually use them as a deadlift variation, right? We can push at maybe a top set with down sets and play around with some stuff like that. I think a lot of people kind of just go through the motions when they do the RDLs, and they don't really put maximum intent into it. So I think that's something that when I put RDLs into the program, I really try to emphasize with my lifters. All right, put high intent into this. Not to say that they shouldn't put high intent into everything, right? We want to execute every exercise in the program with maximum intent. Otherwise, why are we doing it? But for the RDL in particular, I think a lot of people kind of sandbag it, versus it's really important that we train it properly so we don't so that we get the most out of it. Because otherwise you're kind of just going through the motions, not really getting any benefit from it. All right, and so for the last deadlift variation that I really like, depends on if you're a conventional or a sumo puller. And so I'm going to have an answer in this third slot for depending on which type you are. If you're a conventional puller, it depends on how you respond to it, but I like to experiment with a deficit pull. Or if you are a sumo puller, I like to incorporate conventional deadlifts into the program. And so with these are, for the conventional puller, a deficit deadlift, it's going to increase the range of motion. And with these, I like them because in a way, the way I conceptualize it is that we can get more out of less. So yes, the deficit deadlift is generally going to be more fatiguing than a regular competition deadlift. And so real quick, a deficit deadlift is where you're going to be standing on some type of raised platform with just your feet, but then the bar is at the normal spot on the ground. Normally you're going to be about 2 inches off the ground, whether that is a horse stall mat, or maybe you just grab a bumper plate or just a regular plate and you stand on that to create extra range of motion on the conventional deadlift. And so I like this because you can get away, you can do 2 or 3 sets of this and it will feel like more like 4 or 5 sets. It's more fatiguing, but you get extra range of motion, and I generally find that I can get more with less out of these. And so I like using these for conventional pullers, especially in away from competition. It kind of changes up the training a little bit. It also helps with knee extension off the floor, where obviously we'll be training the RDL quite heavily, so that's going to train that hip extension. And so obviously the squat and all the quad training with the squat helps with knee extension in the deadlift, but also I think trying it out with the deficit pull can help with some training the knee extension in the deadlifts and that kind of more deadlift specific angle for a conventional puller. Now, this one is more of not everyone's going to respond well to it. Sometimes that extra range of motion can put people in a weird position or beats them up. So this isn't by far a go-to, but something that I like to try to see if the athlete responds well to, because if they do, then it's just another tool in our kit that we can throw in there if we need to add some variety to the training. And then with sumo pullers, doing in kind of the same fashion, if we're in a training phase away from competition, I like trying to incorporate some conventional deadlifts. Conventional deadlifts are going to, in the same way, train more, you're more horizontal, you're going to get more hip extension in there too, kind of like the RDL. When we get closer to competition, I will keep the RDL in, but I won't have the athlete generally do conventional pulls, versus I think conventional is a great way to build great general strength that can help your sumo. A lot of coaches too think that the conventional pull can help build your strength off the floor with sumo. And so I think it's just a great variation, because sumo is such a technical short range of motion exercise. It's not really great for hypertrophy for the most part. And so using a conventional deadlift during more phases away from competition can be a great way to add variety to the training, get deadlift volume in that can be very useful, but is also not the competition lift. And so once again, depends on the athlete. A lot of times sumo pullers, at least on my roster, a lot of times they are sumo pullers because they aren't good at conventional. And so we might not even do that. But if they have the ability to do it, then I like to incorporate that. In terms of programming these, they're both kind of the same, conventional for sumo or deficit for conventional. You're not going to do a ton of sets. I usually just do 2 to 3 sets. Keep it generally in more of a moderate range. We don't need to go super high rep, but we also don't need to go super low rep, kind of just in that 5 to 7, maybe 8 rep range, which I know can be getting high for some people, but I think that's a kind of a good spot, kind of in that 5 to 8-ish range. And then I generally keep the exertion pretty low there. We don't need to go super heavy on those, because that generally just kind of runs the risk of tweaking stuff. So kind of keep it in that 6 to 7 RPE range. That's how I like to incorporate those. It's kind of just another variation that allows us to build more muscle and more general strength in those areas. So congratulations if you made it this far into the video. Now we're going to go into the bonus section. This is where I'm going to talk about some niche picks that I've used in very, very specific situations that are not common in the meta of powerlifting currently, but have been very useful for very specific situations to get the athlete to do something that we needed. And the first one I'm going to talk about is the box squat. So there's The kind of commonly conceptualized way of doing the box squat is kind of the rolling box squat, which is kind of the West Side barbell way of doing it, where you sit down onto the box, you rock back, and you rock forward and come up. That is not how I program them. I program basically just doing a regular competition squat. You're just coming down and lightly tapping the box at the bottom and then coming back up. So there's two main reasons why I've used this. One, for athletes who are rehabbing something to where we can't do a full range of motion squat without pain. Using the box allows us to have just kind of take some pressure off of the knees and or the back at the bottom by allowing you to rest not really rest, but allows you to kind of dissipate the load in the bottom so it's not as taxing on your back or your knees. And so using it in a rehab setting allows us to still get in squat volume that we can manipulate the height of the box depending on how much range of motion you have. And then let's say you're at a tall box, we can move that down, on a weekly or bi-weekly or whatever type of progression until you can do a full range of motion squat. Then we can take the box out and then progress you into regular squats. So in that case, we're not going to keep it in all the time, right? But it's a great rehab tool for athletes who have injuries that allows us to continually get squat volume in and will allow us to progress back into competition squats faster. The other way I've used it, and I actually have one particular athlete, shout out Taryn, who he uses the box squat in his program all the time. And for him, it was teaching him how to use his hips. Taryn was a very knee forward squatter, had a hard time using his hips. And so we tried a lot of different things. None of those things worked. And eventually I was like, well, let's try the box squat, where we can emphasize sitting back onto the box. And we didn't do the full rolling back, but we set it up to where it was more set at a point to where his legs are on the side of the point. He had to sit back onto the box. He had to use his hips to get down to the box. And we have found that that's the best variation for him, and that it reminds him how to use his hips in the squat. Not that we're overemphasizing the hips. It's still a very balanced squat between his hip and his knee. But if without the box there to remind him on his secondary squat day, we've seen that he forgets how to do it. Like when I've tried to take the box out of the program, the squat regressed or just didn't progress. And so when we've kept the box in there, that's when he made his most progress. He actually just finished a cycle where he hit a 60-pound PR. He went from 465 in his competition earlier this year in May to hitting 525 here in December. So he's added 60 pounds to his squat, squatting twice a week, doing one competition squat and one box squat session per week, and then adding a belt squat on the back end. Those are his kind of 3 squat motions and split squats. So that's where I've used box squat very nichely to teach athletes how to use their hip in the squat, because it's very common these days for certain younger lifters. They just don't understand how to use their hips, and so a box squat can be a great way to teach them how to use their hips. We don't generally need to keep it in all the time. For Taryn, that worked specifically well, so that's what we've done, and it continues to pay off. But you don't necessarily need to keep that in there once they learn it, if it is no longer helping them. Another variation that I think is more of a niche pick that I, once again, don't generally keep in all the time, but I use it as a teaching tool, would be chains. So chains allow us to have accommodating resistance where it's heavier at the top and lighter at the bottom. It's really important that athletes on every single rep of a set, especially your max or your top sets, that you're putting full effort into the bar, that you're not afraid to push as hard as you can into the bar. And certain athletes don't inherently know how to do that right off the bat. They'll put just enough effort into the bar to move it, but they're not putting their maximum effort. Especially when we're doing your down sets where it's more sub-maximal, you still need to be putting maximum intent into the bar, and a lot of athletes just won't do that. They'll kind of just sandbag it, kind of not put their 100% into it. And so using chains, if the athlete doesn't understand how to actually do that, and this is mostly newer athletes that I've worked with, athletes who don't understand how to put their max effort into the bar, I've used chains with, because it reinforces that. It's easier at the bottom, but it gets harder at the top. And also what it does is by getting harder at the top, it gives them more of that feedback of, hey, I can push really hard to the top because something is going to catch me there. A lot of athletes are afraid to really extend their elbow hard or to really extend their knee hard in the squat because they think that it's going to snap their shit, or that it's going to do, they're just afraid to do it. But with chains, it makes it a little bit easier, because as we want them to extend harder it gives that more feedback. And so this is something that I've done with athletes for a block or two, and I really emphasize push as hard as you can into the bar for the entirety of the rep. As soon as you start pushing up, I want you to max effort, no matter what weight, no matter how many reps you're doing, maximum intent every single rep. And so generally I can accomplish this with just cueing, but for athletes who cueing doesn't work in that scenario, I've found that chains can be a great way to help them learn how to do that. And once they know how to do that, they generally don't have to keep chains in. Because otherwise, chains generally, when we're using them all, other than that, they don't train that bottom end as much, the bottom of the range of motion, whether that's off the chest or out of the hole or off the floor. And so you get weaker in that position generally, and that ends up creating a problem later on down the road. So I don't like keeping in chains for a long time, but using it as a reminder in those specific situations, I think helps a lot, and it can be useful for that, just to get them to learn how to put maximum intent into the bar. And then my last niche pick, which once again is a teaching tool, so a lot of my niche picks ends up being more like teaching tool stuff, is the Spoto press. So a Spoto press is where you're going to pause it just an inch off your chest. I want it to be motionless, and then you're going to press up. I program the Spoto press probably a little bit different than a lot of people. I do a 3-second Spoto almost always. I never do it shorter than that. So it's come down, pause an inch off your chest, 1001, 1002, 1003, and I want that pause to be motionless. And so this one, I actually will overcoach this one because I wanted to do something very specific. I don't care about the weight on the bar. I want to teach the athlete how to control the bar. I find that athletes who have a hard time transitioning from a sink to a soft touch and having a controlled touch, where no matter what, they bring the bar down, they sink, they rotate, they roll on the chest because that's just what they're used to. For athletes who can't get over that with either a tempo or some other cueing, I find that a Spoto can help teach them to do that because it's a separate movement than on the chest. It makes it so it's just that it's a completely different thing. They have to think about the movement different. And so then they can focus on, all right, I got to control this bar. I have to make it motionless. And once I can accomplish that, then usually the next block is, all right, 3-second Spoto pause, and then bring it down to a long pause. And that sequence actually has worked really, really well for teaching athletes how to do a correct touch and pause when like a tempo or basic cueing doesn't work. I usually do a Spoto press for low repetitions, lots of sets, and making sure it's more low to moderate RPE and making sure that they can really control it. I'm more emphasizing the control than the weight. This is a very technical movement that I want them to learn so that they can pause better if the other things don't work. And so the other thing is, with all these variations, these are all things that have been, all right, all of the common meta trends haven't worked for this athlete. How can I get them to do what I need them to do? And so that is really important when it comes to variations. And what I really try to hammer home, hopefully on this video, is that as a coach, you need to not just give an athlete a variation because it's the meta or it's the common thing to do. It needs to be very particular to the athlete, and it needs to accomplish the goal that we're going after. If the variation isn't accomplishing the goal, then why are we including it? And that's not useful. And so when including variations, they need to be very specific to the athlete, and they need to be accomplishing a goal. And if we don't have a specific technical thing we need to work on, we don't need to add in a variation. Like, the athlete can just do competition squat twice a week, or competition deadlift, or competition bench. It doesn't have to always be a variation. That's something also I learned earlier on in my coaching, is that I used to think that I always had to use a variation alongside the competition lift. If we don't have a specific reason to do a variation, we don't need to do a variation. Variations need to be specific and accomplish a goal. Well, there's no goal to accomplish there. If they're very technically efficient and it doesn't beat them up, let's just do more competition lift on them, because that's going to be theoretically more effective, because it's going to be more specific. You're going to get more bang for your buck there. So it's very important that we are being very intentional with why we're using variations, not just using variations for the sake of variations. Hopefully this was very useful. If you got to this part in the video, thank you so much for watching all the way through. Don't forget to hit the subscribe and like button, and then comment down below what your favorite variation was. I'll see you guys in the next video. Peace.